Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. My name is Elias Stone, and I was assigned to the Burrow Research Station in Antarctica 3 months ago. This post was meant to be a prestigious step in my career as a research scientist. In my early days at the station, I would stand on the observation deck each morning and watch the endless ice fields stretch toward the horizon. It felt like being on another planet. The sun barely rose during the winter, and the wind never seemed to stop. Despite the harsh conditions, we stayed motivated by the promise of groundbreaking discoveries that might change the world. I never imagined our greatest discovery would spiral into an unimaginable crisis. When I received my transfer orders, I had been told about the significance of our work at Burrow Station. The official documents hinted that we were studying permafrost samples to find unknown microorganisms, but there was an unspoken directive suggesting something far more substantial. Once I arrived, I realized the rumors were true. The government was deeply interested in these ancient organisms discovered beneath the glaciers. The unspoken hope was that these samples might be harnessed to slow human cell aging. People whispered about the possibility of extending the human lifespan by decades, or longer. It all sounded extraordinary, and I believed we were on the cutting edge of science. I lived and worked alongside an elite team of researchers and support staff. Dr. Helen Graves was our lead microbiologist, known for her rigorous standards and kind mentoring style. Dr. Maxwell Reed was a brilliant, yet reserved biochemist, who had contributed to multiple government research projects before arriving here. Nina Alvarez, our lab technician, oversaw the daily tasks of running experiments, analyzing results, and managing the complex apparatus we used in our labs. Stephen Park was in charge of logistics, supplies, and maintaining the aging generator that powered the station. We were a small group, but each of us played a vital role. Our facility was built decades ago and had undergone multiple renovations to meet the evolving standards of high-risk biological research. Every hallway was lined with reinforced metal plating, not just to insulate against the relentless Antarctic cold, but also to provide an extra layer of containment in case of an emergency. The research labs were equipped with airtight containment units, HEPA-filtered ventilation systems, and redundant power sources, ensuring that no hazardous material could escape due to equipment failure. The BSL-4 laboratory was the pinnacle of our facility's security, a sealed, high-containment environment designed for handling the world's most lethal pathogens. Unlike the lower-level BSL-2 and BSL-3 labs, which focused on moderately hazardous or airborne infectious agents, BSL-4 was our last line of defense against the unknown. It operated under negative air pressure, ensuring that even in the event of a structural breach, no airborne pathogen could leak into the rest of the facility. The walls were reinforced with non-porous, chemical-resistant materials, making them easy to sterilize and impermeable to microscopic contaminants. Access to the BSL-4 sector required multiple layers of clearance, including biometric scans, passcode authentication, and decontamination procedures. Every researcher working within it donned a positive pressure suit, tethered to an external air supply to prevent exposure to airborne agents. The only way in or out was through a series of interlocking airlocks, each designed to neutralize potential contaminants through chemical showers and UV sterilization. We believed these protocols made the lab impervious to failure. We believed that as long as we followed protocol, we could control the dangers we studied. That confidence would cost us dearly. In the beginning, everything felt well organized. We focused on thawing sections of glacier ice, extracting microbial material, and carefully monitoring how these ancient organisms interacted with modern cells. The first sign that our mission had deeper layers came when we received orders to speed up the research schedule. This pressure arrived in the form of well-funded shipments of lab equipment and a series of cryptic messages from agency contacts. The cryptic messages usually ended with the phrase, "Leave no stone unturned." With these advanced instruments, We measured gene expressions that were remarkably different from any known living systems. At first, we were excited. There was a real possibility that these microorganisms could transform medical science. We tested the material on rats and hamsters in sealed, pressurized environments. Day after day, we recorded surprising data. The animals displayed heightened regeneration rates, and a few older specimens showed improved vitality. Emails and encrypted messages from our government sponsors became jubilant. We received hints of big announcements and possible visits from high-profile individuals. I remember a day when Dr. Graves and I stood in front of a glass enclosure watching a set of lab rats that had been injected with a solution derived from the microorganism. The rodents appeared energetic. One rat in particular, identified by a small green tag on its ear, seemed to have an unusual resistance to ordinary diseases. That rat had recovered from a respiratory infection in record time. We saw the potential benefits these discoveries could have on extending human life or treating degenerative diseases. We all believed we might be on the brink of a major breakthrough. Soon, however, we noticed changes in a subset of test subjects. A few animals began showing erratic behavior, a departure from their previous states. At first, we presumed it was a quirk of the environment or an unrelated factor. But strange patterns began emerging in their biological data, particularly in their neurological responses. One hamster became so agitated that it gnawed at its enclosure, leaving noticeable tooth marks in the thick material. Another rat, usually timid, displayed aggression toward the other animals in its cage. We quarantined these subjects and assigned Dr. Reed to analyze the samples from their organs. His preliminary findings were unsettling. There appeared to be an unknown agent replicating within their bodies at an unexpected rate. This agent seemed to stimulate certain cells while simultaneously weakening or neutralizing others. We halted the experiments to investigate this new threat, though the official word from our government contacts was to proceed with caution. They urged us to continue because the potential benefits were still considered invaluable to national and global interests. Behind the scenes, tension rose in the station. Stephen Park, who was typically even-tempered, grew apprehensive. He insisted on reinforcing certain sections of the facility and double-checking the backup generators. Nina Alvarez started triple-checking every container's label, verifying that the animals and the microorganisms were secure. Dr. Graves became uncharacteristically distant, as if she harbored worries about the project but felt powerless to stop it. She confided in me late one evening that she found it hard to sleep, concerned that we were stirring up something we barely understand. Despite these murmurs, we carried on. The days fell into a grinding pattern of data collection, lab notes, and intense discussion. No matter our personal unease, the research demanded our focus. I remember wanting to talk to someone outside the facility, maybe a colleague at a major university, to get an external opinion. However, we were required to keep everything classified, and the government's secure lines were our only communication channel. The turning point was an incident that seemed inconspicuous at first. We had a new batch of rodents for controlled testing. One of them carried a version of the microorganism that Dr. Reed had carefully isolated. That afternoon, Nina Alvarez was completing routine checks in the animal holding area. She wore the appropriate gear, gloves, goggles, and a lab coat. I was in an adjacent room, sorting slides and preparing a microscope. Out of nowhere, I heard a yelp of alarm through the intercom. I rushed over to find Nina cradling her hand with a pained expression. She said that one of the infected hamsters had bitten her finger through a small rip in her glove. The hamster had never acted aggressively before, but it had lunged at her the instant she opened its cage. Nina's wound was small, yet it was deep enough to draw concern. Dr. Graves stepped in to clean and disinfect the wound, scolding the rest of us to be more vigilant with safety gear. Nina was quarantined in the medical bay for observation. Over the radio, we relayed the incident to our superiors. They responded quickly with a procedure we had never heard of, an immediate request for detailed biological data on Nina, and an order to halt other lines of research temporarily. We followed every instruction. Nina, feeling alarmed but initially stable, cooperated with blood samples, scans, and temperature checks. For about 2 days, Nina showed no obvious sign of illness, aside from slight discomfort in her finger. We held on to a faint hope that the hamster's bite was an isolated mishap. Lab tests, however, told a different story. Markers in her blood work began shifting, displaying parallels to the infected animals. The government recommended an aggressive round of experimental antiviral treatments, all flown in from a specialized facility. We were to administer these treatments without delay. Nina consented, hoping it would simply be a precaution. I remember the tense conversations in the break room. The others were restless. A hush fell over everyone whenever the topic of Nina's health came up. Stephen Park made sure the station's internal locks were tested, as if anticipating something unspoken. Dr. Reed spent hours studying the microorganisms, possibly hoping to find a partial antidote. Dr. Graves handled the daily treatments for Nina, who became increasingly pale and lethargic. Nina's gaze had a dull, unfocused quality when I visited her. By the evening of the 3rd day, Nina's condition deteriorated rapidly. She stopped speaking and showed minimal reactions when Dr. Graves checked her vital signs. Something was happening to her skin. It began to look unnaturally stiff in certain areas. We placed her in a containment room with built-in cameras. Although we wished to provide the best care possible, we were instructed to keep her under strict observation. I recall standing with Dr. Reed in front of the observation window, listening to the hum of the air filtration system. Nina's posture was oddly rigid as she walked in slow, unsteady circles within her isolated chamber. Late that night, our monitoring equipment picked up anomalies in her heartbeat and brain activity. We tried to communicate through an intercom, but Nina did not respond. She approached the window, her eyes distant, her expression vacant. At one point, she pressed her hand against the glass, then scraped her fingernails along it. This silent action set everyone on edge. We realized we were witnessing the same behavioral shift we had recorded in the infected animals, agitation and aggression without apparent reason. The next morning, we gathered to discuss how to manage the situation. Dr. Reed suggested we attempt another round of treatments, but Dr. Graves expressed doubt. The transformation had progressed so quickly that no standard measure seemed likely to stop it. Our data indicated that the organism was saturating her system, altering fundamental aspects of her physiology. I observed the video feed and noted that Nina had begun pacing with more energy, as though searching for a way out. We decided to reach out to the government for immediate evacuation support. The station's official stance was that we needed specialized medical experts and secure facilities to contain any threat. Our sponsors promised they would dispatch a rescue team in under 48 hours. Their quick confirmation seemed reassuring, but it would prove to be another piece of a puzzle we had barely begun to comprehend. Before the rescue team could arrive, Nina displayed a startling new level of volatility. She began striking the door of the containment unit, pressing her face against the observation window. Our limited sedation attempts failed. Dr. Graves suggested lowering the temperature in the containment room slightly, hoping to slow the microorganism. We tried that, and for a few hours Nina seemed less energetic, retreating to a corner. Meanwhile, Dr. Reed analyzed fresh samples from the animals that had also shown drastic changes. He found that these creatures not only had heightened aggression, but also displayed unusual resilience. Another disturbing detail surfaced. The microorganisms appeared to disrupt normal metabolic processes, effectively pushing the hosts into a state of unstoppable desire to bite or infect other living beings. This led us to an alarming realization. We were dealing with something that could spread through saliva or open wounds, turning living organisms into carriers of this phenomenon. I spent time with Dr. Graves in her personal office, going over possible scenarios. She admitted to me that she had read old research logs from the earliest scientists at Burrow Station, some never made public. Those logs hinted that decades ago, another team had discovered a microbe capable of reactivating animal tissues, though the logs ended abruptly. The original project had apparently been abandoned, sealed away, and kept secret. We were picking up the threads of a past that had been deliberately hidden. In quiet conversations with Stephen Park, I learned that he had caught fragments of transmissions from our sponsors. He found references to extreme measures and extermination protocols. At first, I dismissed the notion as paranoid speculation. However, the weight of that possibility began to trouble me. Our requests for rescue were met too quickly with a promise of immediate action. It was as if they already knew how dire the circumstances were. 48 hours passed, and we received confirmation that a special operations unit would land at a makeshift runway a few kilometers from the station. Their official mission was to evacuate our personnel and sanitize any potential hazards. That morning, I woke up exhausted from the relentless stress of the previous days. I realized I had neglected my own well-being, skipping meals and relying on coffee. The rest of the team looked equally drained. Security cameras continued to show Nina within her containment room, her movements unnatural. She paced in a near-endless loop. At times she would stop and stare directly into the camera, as though aware we were watching. Then we got a call on the station's secure line. A masked voice, likely someone from a government agency, stated that the incoming rescue team was cleared to enforce a full containment protocol. The voice repeated that phrase twice. Dr. Graves asked for clarification, but the line went silent. That moment raised suspicion that rescue might just be a euphemism for something else. Stephen Park insisted we check the perimeter cameras. The feed, though partly obscured by swirling snow and ice, captured the silhouette of a small approaching convoy. The vehicles moved carefully across the icy terrain. We could not see any clear markings. Before we could greet them, we lost contact with external channels. The entire station's communication system went down. We had a backup system, but it too showed no signal. Dr. Reed attempted a manual override, but the lines remained dead. It was as if someone had jammed our signals. We waited near the main entrance, prepared for any type of official rescue. When the outer doors hissed open, a group of individuals wearing full tactical gear stepped inside. Their faces were concealed by masks. One carried an electronic tablet, while the others held weapons. There was no standard greeting or expression of concern for our well-being. They scanned the room and asked how many people were still alive and uninfected. Dr. Graves tried to explain the situation, but they only repeated their question. Stephen Park, who rarely lost his composure, asked who was in command. No direct answer came. Instead, one of the masked individuals held out a device that started beeping. They seemed to be scanning us, perhaps checking for signs of infection. Dr. Graves calmly pointed them to the containment room where Nina was held. Another figure stepped forward and demanded to see all research data, samples, and lab notes. Their tone left no room for negotiation. I personally led them to the BSL-4 lab, while Dr. Graves stayed behind, unsure of how to handle the outsiders. The group took stock of our containment procedures and tested the air for contaminants. They forced us to unlock every secure storage cabinet containing vials of the microorganism. They asked specific questions about replication speeds and transmission vectors, using scientific terminology that suggested specialized training. Their knowledge of the research was uncanny. At one point, I noticed Dr. Reed whisper something to Dr. Graves. She appeared unsettled by the exchange. Once the group had inventoried the lab, they requested to be taken to Nina's containment chamber. By then, Nina had begun to move erratically again. She turned sharply at the slightest noise. Her teeth made clacking sounds against the glass as she tested the barrier. The masked individuals set up specialized equipment around the containment door and readied what looked like a specialized tranquilizer, or possibly something more lethal. None of them attempted to communicate with Nina or offer medical aid. It became clear that these people were not here to rescue Nina or help any infected individuals. They were here to remove all traces of the organism, and possibly us, if we posed a risk of spreading it. Dr. Graves confronted one of them, pointing out that Nina could be saved if we were allowed more time. She argued that this station had the best chance of creating a countermeasure, since we had direct access to the microorganisms. The masked person responded by stating that containment overrides research and that no further discussion was necessary. The next words were unforgettable. All compromised personnel must be neutralized. A moment of tense silence filled the corridor. I glanced around, searching for any sign of empathy in these masked individuals. Instead, they positioned themselves in a strategic formation, blocking every exit. Dr. Reed, who had been silent, stepped forward and tried to reason with them. He explained that destroying the samples would set humanity back, after we had already uncovered data that could revolutionize medicine. One of the masked figures insisted that they would handle future steps, and that the station's current staff was no longer essential. Stephen Park placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered that we should not resist openly, at least not yet. His intuition about the group's intentions was grimly accurate. We had never been the priority. The group's abrupt arrival and immediate lockdown of the station indicated they might have planned for a worst-case scenario long before we even called for help. While the confrontation with the masked group was unfolding, an alarm sounded on the far side of the station. The lights in the corridor turned red, signaling a breach in one of the containment areas. Some of the infected lab animals must have broken free. The group's leader ordered a split. Half would sweep the facility to locate and eradicate any infected creatures, while the others stayed to deal with Nina's chamber. I rushed to the lab with Dr. Reed to secure the rest of the animals, but we discovered that 2 rat enclosures had been opened. Paw prints led to an air duct, and the scratch marks around the vent suggested they had managed to crawl inside. We reported this to the masked individuals, who looked ready for the worst. Moments later, gunfire echoed from somewhere near the living quarters. Apparently, one of the team members had encountered an infected creature and responded with lethal force. The tension in the station escalated. The group leader turned to us and stated that every living thing infected by these microorganisms must be destroyed, including Nina, if she had reached an irreversible stage. They asked us to surrender or be treated as potential threats. Dr. Graves looked at me, her eyes filled with a sense of dread I had never seen in her before. She told them that we could still attempt an antidote if they gave us more time. They refused. One of the masked individuals pressed a device on the chamber door. Gas started to pump into Nina's containment cell. She became frantic, slamming her body against the walls. The glass began to fracture under her constant impact. Dr. Graves tried to plead, but another masked person restrained her. For a moment, I felt everything spinning out of control. I sensed the weight of an outcome none of us wanted. Nina was beyond saving in their eyes, and they intended to remove her and any risk she posed to the outside world. Suddenly, a loud crash reverberated through the containment area. The glass gave way and Nina emerged, staggering forward. She moved with a speed I had never seen before, heading straight for one of the masked individuals. Their reflexes were quick. They discharged a weapon, striking Nina multiple times. She collapsed to the ground. In that moment, the masked leader fired a single shot with a different device. Nina went still. None of us spoke. The only sounds came from the gas still hissing in the partially damaged system. Nina lay motionless. Dr. Graves turned away, trying to maintain composure, while Dr. Reed stood frozen. Stephen Park clenched his fists but said nothing. A masked team member checked Nina's vital signs and then shook their head. The group's leader said, "One threat contained." They did not allow us time to process the situation. Instead, they ordered us to gather in the station's communal hall. The echoes of their footsteps filled the corridors. Each door we passed was sealed behind us. One of them carried a metal briefcase. I glimpsed vials inside, labeled with our station's identification codes, presumably the last of the microorganisms. The rest of their unit spread out, systematically planting devices around the facility. Although they did not openly state it, those devices had the hallmark shape of explosives intended to eradicate all traces of infection. When we arrived at the communal hall, the masked leader informed us that a helicopter would arrive to transport relevant personnel away from the station, but only after the station had been sterilized In the next breath, they declared that our entire team had too much exposure to the pathogen to be guaranteed safe passage. Another masked figure added that the official record would classify our team as having succumbed during the outbreak. I stared at them in disbelief, realizing that every single one of us was seen as a risk. The plan was to leave no witnesses. Stephen Park exchanged glances with me and Dr. Reed. We were surrounded, but we were not entirely helpless. Dr. Graves quietly inched closer to a storage closet, feigning compliance. Inside that closet were tools and some items that could be used defensively. The masked group started a final sweep of the station. They told us to stay in place. They also indicated that attempts to escape would be met with immediate force. Dr. Reed, though usually quiet, motioned that we might have one chance to save ourselves. We still had access to a remote section of the station's underground level that the masked team didn't appear to know about. It was a small storage depot beneath the old meteorological wing. If we could reach it, we might find a way around the locked corridors, or at least buy ourselves some time. We pretended to comply for a short while, waiting until the group was distracted by the commotion in the corridors. Another infected rat, or perhaps a hamster, had triggered a door sensor. The masked team members rushed to neutralize it, leaving only one guard to watch us. We seized that moment. Dr. Graves signaled to Stephen Park, who shoved a large equipment cart toward the lone guard. The guard stumbled, allowing us to break into a run. Dr. Graves and Stephen Park led the way, while Dr. Reed and I followed close behind. We navigated a narrow service tunnel, an area seldom used except for maintenance tasks. The old metal steps groaned under our weight as we descended into the lower level. Our flashlights flickered, illuminating dusty walls and a row of heavy doors. The station had expanded over the years, and some original sections had been abandoned or repurposed. The area we sought was behind a door with a faded sign that read, "Meteorological Storage." Inside, we found racks of old weather instruments, crates of archived documents, and several small generators. It was cold and dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering at irregular intervals. Dr. Graves crouched behind a crate, rummaging for anything we could use to fend off the intruders. Stephen Park tested the generator, hoping to power up a console that might control some of the station's locked doors or override the communication jamming. We could hear muffled footsteps and urgent voices above us. The masked team must have realized we were gone. Dr. Reed discovered an old blueprint for the station. If the data was correct, there was a disused corridor leading from this storage room to the surface. However, it was uncertain if it had been sealed years ago. We decided to take our chances, as staying put meant certain capture. Following the blueprint, we moved deeper into the station's sublevels. Every step we took kicked up dust, revealing cobwebs in the corners. The corridor narrowed until we reached a locked hatch with signs of rust around the edges. Stephen Park and I used crowbars found among the old tools to pry it open. Behind that hatch, a metallic ladder stretched upward. The cold air that rushed in was even more intense than in the main building. Snowflakes drifted down from above, indicating that the exit was partially exposed to the elements. It led to an outside location, some distance from the main entrance. We heard loud noises echoing through the vents. The masked individuals had placed charges and were preparing to detonate them. Our time was running out. Dr. Graves, who had always been level-headed, looked over her shoulder and urged everyone to climb. The plan was to reach the surface, skirt around the station, and possibly locate the convoy vehicles. If we could start one of them, we might escape before everything was destroyed. One by one, we ascended the ladder, our breaths forming vapor clouds. Dr. Reed went first, then Dr. Graves, followed by Stephen Park. I waited at the bottom, shining my flashlight into the darkness. I spotted a figure moving at the far end of the corridor. It was definitely one of the masked team members. They raised something that looked like a rifle. I shouted for everyone to hurry. The figure advanced, but the confining space made it hard for them to get a clear angle. I rushed up the ladder, hearing a shot ricochet off the metal walls. The hatch led to a cramped exit in an outbuilding near a ridge of ice. We emerged into a storm, The wind whipped flakes of snow in every direction, and the dim sunlight barely penetrated the heavy clouds. We had no clear vantage point to see the main structure. We only heard distant rumbling as the massed group continued placing charges. Dr. Graves motioned for us to stick close. We tried to circle around a small ridge, hoping to spot the convoy or any sign of a helicopter landing zone. As we crested a small rise, we saw the convoy vehicles parked in a clearing. Their engines were still warm, and there were footprints everywhere. The masked team clearly planned on using those vehicles again. We crouched behind a large snowdrift, formulating a plan. Stephen Park believed he could hotwire one of the vehicles if we could reach it without attracting attention. The wind howled, and any tracks we made quickly disappeared under drifting snow. We crawled and huddled low, inching closer to the first vehicle in the line. Dr. Graves kept a watchful eye on the ridge behind us. Dr. Reed clutched a small box of gear we had taken from the meteorological storage, which included a flare gun. We almost made it to the side of the vehicle when a sudden shout cut through the storm. Two of the masked individuals stood near another vehicle. They had spotted us and aimed their weapons. A standoff seemed imminent. Stephen Park immediately ducked behind the vehicle's fender, trying to find the ignition wiring. Dr. Graves slowly raised her hands, attempting to appear non-threatening. Dr. Reed lifted the flare gun, hesitating. At that moment, a powerful explosion resonated from the direction of the station. Fire and smoke briefly illuminated the horizon, followed by a wave of frigid air. The masked individuals glanced behind them. The station was partially engulfed, sending a plume of debris into the sky. Their plan to destroy all evidence had clearly begun. We took advantage of their distraction. Dr. Reed fired the flare gun at the ground near the masked individuals to confuse them. The bright flash and smoke gave us a brief opening to scramble into the vehicle. Stephen Park managed to start it. The tires spun on the ice, but we gained traction. The masked figures opened fire, and we heard bullets ping off the metal exterior. We sped away, the storm swallowing us as we navigated the treacherous terrain. For several minutes we drove in silence, the vehicle's heater barely enough to keep us conscious in the bitter cold. Dr. Graves tapped the dashboard in search of a functional radio but found none. We had no way of knowing if there were more units out there or if a helicopter was still inbound. Dr. Reed pressed his forehead against the window, staring into the swirling ice. Stephen Park gripped the wheel, determined to put distance between us and the station. I scanned our surroundings, seeing nothing but white expanse. In the back of my mind, I tried to process the day's events. Nina was gone, and the station was almost certainly lost to the charges set by the masked team. We had bits and pieces of data saved on portable drives. Whether the group had secured the rest of our research was unknown. They might have destroyed everything, or they might have kept crucial samples for their own purposes. We traveled for hours, unsure of our heading. Stephen Park guided us using a compass and a general sense of direction, gleaned from old station maps. Eventually, the vehicle's fuel gauge edged toward empty. We found ourselves in a desolate region of ice fields, with rocky outcrops in the distance. The sun was setting, though sunset in Antarctica at this time of year was barely distinguishable from midday gloom. We spotted a small abandoned structure nestled against a rocky rise. Perhaps it was an old expedition shack left behind decades ago. We parked, deciding to take our chances inside rather than freeze in the open. Dr. Graves and Stephen Park searched the interior. It was dark and damp, with crates strewn about. Some old tools were rusted into useless hunks of metal. However, there was a battered stove that might still work. We used what limited fuel remained in the vehicle's spare canister to light a small fire for warmth. Huddled around that makeshift heater, we took stock. Dr. Graves did a quick health check on each of us. None of us showed signs of infection from the microorganisms, at least not yet. Dr. Reed recounted how, just days before, he believed we were on the verge of a miracle that could rewrite the science of aging. Now we were fugitives, uncertain if the outside world knew anything about the outbreak, or if more extermination teams were on the way. We stayed awake as long as we could, sharing theories about what might happen next. Stephen Park suggested we try to reach the nearest international base or attempt to make radio contact with any Antarctic station that might still be operational. We had no illusions about rescue. If the group that came for us represented official policy, they would likely track us down and silence us. That night, none of us truly rested. The howling wind made it hard to concentrate, and the cold seeped through every crack in the old shack. We took turns keeping watch, peering through a tiny window for any sign of approaching lights or vehicles. The memory of Nina's transformation and the group's merciless response weighed heavily on us. There was also the possibility that one of us could have been exposed without realizing it, since the pathogen appeared to spread with the slightest contact. In the early hours of the morning, Dr. Graves found a battered radio transceiver in one of the crates. It looked old, possibly from the 1970s, and the wires were frayed. Nonetheless, she and Stephen Park tried to see if it could be repaired. If we could transmit a signal, maybe we could reach an independent station or a passing aircraft. We fumbled with the wires, rigging a temporary power source from a generator in the vehicle. Static filled the airwaves as we turned the dial, searching for any frequency that might yield a response. We finally picked up something faint. It was distorted, possibly in another language. Dr. Reed thought he recognized a call sign from a Russian or European research facility. We attempted to respond, but the signal was too weak. We heard only fragments, words that might have indicated an emergency situation unfolding elsewhere, or perhaps standard weather reporting. We tried again and again until the radio fell silent. In the quiet that followed, Dr. Graves recounted how she ended up at Burrow Station. She had once worked for a major university, but was recruited by a secretive branch of the government. Her expertise in microbiology made her a prime candidate. She admitted that she had always been curious about old rumors concerning pathogens locked in Arctic and Antarctic ice. The dream was to harness something that could revitalize human cells. Now she felt haunted by the realization that this dream had become a nightmare. Stephen Park added that the government likely had contingencies for outbreaks like this. All those references to extermination protocols suggested that they had known such a threat was possible. Dr. Reed speculated that if the group destroyed the station, they might claim it was an accident or a reactor malfunction. The truth, that it was an intentional act to eliminate any evidence, would remain buried in the polar darkness. As daylight struggled to break through the storm clouds, we packed what supplies we could. Our plan was tentative at best. We would drive until we found another station or we ran out of fuel. The harsh conditions made it probable that we would have to travel part of the way on foot. We hoped that somewhere in this frozen landscape, we could encounter other researchers, or an outpost that had no allegiance to the same sponsors that betrayed us. We left the shack behind, the small fire sputtering out. The vehicle started with a reluctant rumble. Snow sprayed from the wheels as we continued our journey. We navigated carefully around crevasses marked on an old map. Each hour we checked the radio, but we heard only static. Our path wound around a series of ice ridges that towered above us like silent guardians. Eventually, the last drop of fuel burned away, and the vehicle sputtered to a stop. We stared out at a field of jagged ice, realizing we would have to go on foot if we wanted to survive. We gathered coats, boots, and whatever rations we could find. Dr. Graves looked at me with a somber expression. She handed me a small flash drive, saying it contained everything she had managed to save from the lab servers. The raw data about the microorganism, its potential benefits, and the terrifying implications of the outbreak. "We need the world to know," she said quietly. We walked. The cold gnawed at our limbs, and we took slow, measured steps. Stephen Park led the way, occasionally checking the compass. Dr. Reed and Dr. Graves trudged behind him, while I brought up the rear, watching for any sign of pursuit. Though the masked team might still be searching for us, the miles of blizzard conditions provided some camouflage. If the microorganisms had spread further, we did not see any outward sign of it here, far from the station. Yet we knew it might only be a matter of time before the infection found new hosts, human or otherwise. At one point, we paused for water and to catch our breath. Dr. Graves stared across the horizon, her eyes reflecting the pale sunlight. She confessed that she had been hopeful when we started our research. She dreamt of a future where age-related diseases were conquered. Now she felt responsible, in part, for everything that had gone wrong. Stephen Park tried to reassure her that none of us could have predicted how quickly the virus would mutate, or that the government would respond so violently. Though we refrained from using extreme words, it was evident we had become fugitives carrying secrets that many powerful people would prefer to bury. Our footsteps pressed onward, leaving footprints that the wind quickly erased. Several days drifted by in a haze of cold and exhaustion. It was a guessing game whether we might stumble upon a friendly outpost, or if we would succumb to the elements first. The rations we had salvaged from the vehicle began to dwindle. Dr. Reed grew quieter each day, possibly from the strain. Stephen Park, driven by resilience, continued to navigate, though none of us were sure if the direction we headed offered true hope. Eventually, our radio crackled to life again. Through bursts of static, we made out an automated beacon from a remote station. It repeated coordinates and a brief message in multiple languages, stating it was an unmanned weather relay site. This was not the rescue we wanted, but it could be enough to get us shelter and possibly send a signal out that wasn't jammed. We rerouted, trudging toward that location, stepping over ice ridges and around deep crevasses. Late one afternoon, we spotted the antenna mast of a small weather station perched on a ridge. It was a squat metal structure, no bigger than a storage shed. Inside, we found basic instruments, a generator, and a battered radio console. Stephen Park powered it up with a combination of leftover fuel from canisters stored on site. Static filled the air once more, but then faint signals came through. We tried to respond, broadcasting our location and asking for help. Minutes stretched into hours, and we received no reply beyond the automated weather updates from distant locations. Nevertheless, we decided to remain in this relay station for a bit, because it offered more protection from the wind than wandering on open ice. Dr. Graves set to work trying to refine our message, adjusting frequencies on the console. Dr. Reed inspected the minimal supplies. There was a small crate of emergency rations and a water filtration system. We had a chance, albeit slim, to survive a little longer. While Dr. Graves kept vigil at the radio, I scrolled through the data on the flash drive she had given me. The files catalogued everything: the original microorganisms, our tests on rats and hamsters, the aggression that soon followed, and the unstoppable transformation. There were references to older logs from scientists who once inhabited Burrow Station. Many questions remained unanswered. Who first discovered these microorganisms decades ago? How many times had the government tried to harness them? And how many attempts had ended in outbreaks that no one ever heard about? Each of us carried the weight of what had happened to Nina, to the other staff members, and to the station itself. We found ourselves in a precarious position, living witnesses to an event we suspected the authorities intended to bury forever. If we could find a way to return to civilization, perhaps we could reveal the truth, or perhaps we would be hunted until every shred of evidence was erased. The nights in the relay station were long. The wind rattled the metal walls. Stephen Park scouted the surrounding terrain by day, searching for any possible rescue route. Dr. Reed busied himself analyzing leftover notes. Dr. Graves continued refining our attempts at radio communication, hoping to reach anyone who might listen. I alternated between helping them and writing down my own recollection of events. Some days, it felt like a losing battle. We heard planes pass overhead at extreme altitudes, but we never saw rescue craft come close. When we tried to broadcast on open frequencies, we got only static, as if someone was still jamming us, or as if the swirling storms blocked our signals. Yet we refused to give in. Perhaps, somewhere beyond these icy expanses, there was a chance to tell our story and prevent a larger catastrophe. We remain in a state of uncertainty, The microorganisms we unearthed could exist in other hidden pockets of ice, and if they reach a broader population, the consequences could be devastating. The memory of Nina's final moments still burns in my mind. The masked individuals showed no compassion. They were there to eliminate any perceived threat, including innocent people. I replay the events of that horrifying day. An accidental bite in a sealed lab leading to a chain reaction of aggression and the unstoppable spread of a virus. It happened so fast. We keep the memory of our colleagues alive. Nina, who had been such a dedicated lab technician, and others who never had the chance to escape. Dr. Graves repeats that we must do everything possible to share our data. Dr. Reed contemplates the next steps in creating a remedy if we ever find a fully equipped lab again. Stephen Park is determined to keep us alive for as long as it takes. As for me, I write this account in hopes that someday it will be found. Though the station behind us is nothing more than twisted metal and scorched remains, the threat may not be over. The microorganisms could still exist in samples hidden in some vault or container the masked team took with them. Another outbreak could be just around the corner. We might be the only ones who understand the full implications. What I can promise is that we will never give up trying to warn others, even if the government tries to silence us. Every day I remind myself why we keep going. The world deserves to know the truth. The real story of what happened at Burrow Research Station cannot be buried under the ice. If this message reaches anyone, I urge caution. Be mindful of what lies beneath those frozen glaciers. Some discoveries are not worth the cost, and some secrets should not be unleashed on an unsuspecting world. That is our reality now. We cling to the hope that there is a future where humanity learns from these mistakes and treats unknown forces with respect and caution. Until that day comes, we remain in the freezing darkness of Antarctica, uncertain and carrying a secret that might be more dangerous than we can fully comprehend. We left our home station as survivors of a nightmare. Only time will tell if we become casualties of a larger cover-up, or if we live long enough to share a warning about the silent menace that reanimates life under the thick ice. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.